I'm Jacob Fathbruckner, owner-operator of Ralpartha Legacy, with Tom Meier, who everybody watching this, most people should know, but Tom was one of the founders and primary sculptor at Ralpartha Enterprises. From 75 to 96, I think, is when you guys sold to FASA. Somewhere in there.
You can tell me better than I can tell you.
And Tom started up Thunderbolt Mountain in 1988, I believe.
Well, then I guess, yeah.
And has sculpted for a number of companies over the years, including Citadel, Dark Sword, Lance and Laser.
Yep,
and
a few things for them.
Probably a few others also. Curacao.
Right, and also the people up in Canada.
Ratham?
Yeah.
I didn't know you did some exclusive pieces for them.
No, in exchange for cigars.
Really?
Yeah, I did some medieval pieces that were like crews to different things.
The first company you worked for would have been
The Kriegspielers.
the Kriegspielers, I think. I think Heritage was when Duke moved out west,
Right.
I think. And who was you had met your contact for that company was the man who first talked to you about sculpting.
Right, that was Stan Glanson.
So when it comes to the inspiration or the concepts that you held, obviously the thing you're most known for is Elves. But you've mentioned before some of your inspiration on how you chose armor styles and things. Would you like to share that?
Well, initially, when I was first tasked with making an elf for fantasy gaming, the depictions I could find in art were either of that kind of elf, of like a human-sized warrior elf. They all looked like Robin Hood, just medieval peasants and things. And I didn't think that had enough air of exotic or mysterious, magical, fantastical to it. So the first thing I tried to do was give them unusual versions of armor that I found pictures of. A lot of times in fairy tale books you'll find interesting armors, and some of the inspiration I got was from like the series by Andrew Lang, the different colored fairy books.
Okay.
The illustrators in those were very good, line illustrations of course, but very good illustrations with some interesting ideas in them that were, fit my idea of the exotic. With the wood elves, obviously you got a woodland theme, but then I had to decide what to do about high elves, and I was thinking, well, if wood elves are relatively plain and medieval with mysterious elements, then who's the most sophisticated nearby medieval civilization that would, put the northern Europeans in the same relationship as wood elves to high elves? And I thought, well, there's Byzantines and Italians who are, kind of influenced by the Byzantines, because the Byzantines held Italy till quite late after the Western Roman Empire fell. And that's where I picked up the ideas for high elves.
Okay. So was that sort of a Renaissance Italy or earlier?
Early, yeah, late medieval, early Renaissance, and like I said, I also drew from Byzantine armor and such, which looks quite exotic by comparison to Northern European stuff at the time. Although the Northern European courts used to ape, after the First Crusade, they used to ape Byzantine clothing and things for the status it gave them.
And I believe you had said you chose the barboot helmet, right?
Yeah, the barboot was a helmet that was in some ways similar to an ancient Greek Corinthian helmet, and because the barboot is less well known as being a medieval Italian helmet, when I made elves in barboots, other people liked the design, and so it was copied widely amongst other miniatures companies, and they all interpreted it as a Greek helmet, and it gave them the rest of the Greek paraphernalia that went with the Greek helmet. But that's not what I'd originally intended.
Great.
I'd intended like Renaissance Italy.
Nice. As far as their facial features, I know you've talked before about trying to distinguish them a little bit from humans.
Right.
Would you share some of those details?
Well, the most common thing, of course, is pointed ears, but I try to play that down and work instead on a kind of refined facial feature. my ideal, and I think this is the expression you're trying to get me to say, my ideal expression for particularly a high elf is a cross between an angel and a praying mantis.
Here you go. That's a line that stuck in my head.
Yeah, because you want that, if you've ever gotten close to a praying mantis, you want that weird kind of vibe they give you when they just move their head to look at you and they're completely unafraid. And
like a coldness.
yeah, coldness and just an alienness. It's just not, it's not human. But at the same time, they're beautiful. So they strike your sense of beauty, but in an alien way. And that would be the ideal. If I had been in charge of making the Lord of the Rings movies, I would have inserted into the soundtrack, whenever an elf was speaking, like a faint musical tone. You know, like wind chimes or something almost behind it. It's
Otherworldly.
just something in their voice that is different from the way a human speaks.
That'd be neat. And now maybe I picked up on something that wasn't there, but in the early and mid 80s, as you kept adding some more elves to basically your Ralpartha stuff, it seemed to me that their eyes started getting a little bit bigger and maybe a little more almond shaped.
Well, I always did them that way. The slanted eyes is again a thing that doesn't look, it doesn't look wrong, but it doesn't exactly look human.
Yeah, it's just different.
Yeah, I mean, it's different, strange. And the same with the very high cheekbones and, you know, the basically refined features.
Great. So let's see, there's a little bit of elves. For goblins, not specifically to the 30 millimeter, just in general for you. Now, one of the differences between your perspective and some people who came into the fantasy world a little later is you pretty much see orcs and goblins as interchangeable parts of one whole, right?
Right. It's just a scale. You know,
Okay.
they go from imps to goblins to orcs.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify
Orc's
that.
just a word for a demon, and goblin is too.
Same, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in a more modern context that they've been separated a little more. But you also, last time I was here, you were talking about if you were to have some painted up, there was a specific color scheme you were considering would look
I'd
nice.
make them look bruised. You know, I wouldn't make them a consistent color. You know, one general skin tone. I'd make them look mottled and like they'd been, you know, like they had a pale-ish skin, but it had been just bruised all over with, you know, purples and livid colors. You know.
So kind of like from a permanently at war state, kind of.
Well, just, you know, to make them look more hideous.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's, a consistent flesh tone, you know, no matter what the tone is, green or purple or whatever, is not as repulsive as somebody who looks like they're diseased,
right?
You know, because their skin's all different colors.
Gotcha. Did you? Now, Tolkien's probably your main inspiration.
Well, that's the fundamental for the whole modern fantasy thing is,
right.
is take off on Tolkien. Well, for most of it. I mean, there's some people that went their own directions. But.
Yeah. So do you, when you, especially earlier on when you were thinking about orcs and goblins, were you trying to depict something that was very specific or a more general thing? I guess I'm sort of leaning towards, were you thinking more demonic or more some other type of biped?
No, I was thinking more, in Tolkien, of course, he talks about them as a corrupted or manufactured race of demi-human things that are completely evil. And that's more what I had in mind. I experimented with several different designs early on before I finally decided to adopt, you know, the kind of ape-like posture and the big round head, you know, which is something actually Tolkien mentions in The Hobbit, I think. He talks about the great goblin having an enormous round head.
Yeah. And so would you specifically use orc to describe the bigger goblinoids
Right.
then? Okay.
I call them giant goblins or orcs or whatever you want. I mean, they're interchangeable in the thing.
And through the history of, especially Ralpartha, depending on what year the catalog came out, your orcs and goblins could be called orcs, goblins, hobgoblins, greater goblins. I assume mainly just based on who was doing the typing.
Right, probably.
Let's see. as to dwarves, now up until this Kickstarter release, the dwarves I was most familiar with you doing. I know you've done some, like a couple for Ludwig, Dark Sword, that is, in the recent years. So specifically on your older dwarves, was there any particular inspiration you stuck to on that?
Well, now, unlike elves, dwarves had a well-established look, which fitted right in. So I just took it. I mean, you can look at old book illustrations by people like Arthur Rackham and such, and they have, I mean, a dwarf looks like a dwarf. You just, maybe most dwarves don't have that much hair as the dwarves in Tolkien with the big long beards and things, but other than that, that's the way they're depicted. You can look at old illustrations of the Wagner's Ring Cycle, and you'll see the depiction of the Nibelungs or the dwarves as being just the way that they're still depicted in.
Interesting. And then you had mentioned before that halflings, you had thought Tolkien had a specific use for those. Is that something about bringing children into the storyline?
Oh yeah, I picked that up off several people who have read Tolkien and did critical things on it. Said that he essentially was trying to interject children into a story for adults, and he didn't want to because it was a little bit too, I guess he felt it was a little bit too twee to have actual children be the heroes, so he created a race of children. They're always hungry, they're flippant in a lot of ways, but they're innocent, they have all the characteristics of children except they're older.
So that, it's safe to say then that that was something you kept in mind when you did your initial halflings for Ralph Partha, because they all have a very cherub-like face.
Right.
And I think especially compared to some of the other people who sculpted halflings over time, yours did have a almost a gentleness to them that a lot of the bigger sculpts tended to lose. They definitely look different than just a beardless dwarf.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the body's completely different. I mean, this is one of the important things about controlling proportions very tightly. It's sort of similar to the problem of what's the difference between a giant and a guy who's just a different scale. You have to rearrange the proportions to get it to look like a giant no matter what you put it next to. And it's the same with the hobbit versus dwarf. A dwarf you do with very short arms and legs, because that's dwarfism, and a largish head by comparison to the rest of his body, because although there are several different kinds of dwarves, they don't all develop the bone structure in the face that's different, but they all have shortened, long bones. The bones in their fingers, the bones in their arms, and the bones in their legs are the most affected. They just don't grow very long. Other than that, they're just like the same as a person. If you stretch all the bones out, they'd be a normal stature person.
Gotcha.
So they have the look that gives them, though, with the short arms and legs, is they look like they've got a barrel chest, and their arms almost stick out a little bit to the sides when they walk or move or whatever, and their heads look overly big. But if you're doing children, then children have a different set of proportions. Their arms and legs are not out of proportion to their body. Their head is much bigger than an adult. And that's, this is one of the things where if you don't make a head of your adult with true proportions, then you can't distinguish a child. It's sort of like the way they used to draw children in very early Renaissance paintings, where they just draw a little tiny adult with adult proportions. And you can see that in works before, the High Renaissance, that a lot of times a lot of times you'll see it in, what do you call it, amateur, like folk art. They'll draw a child as the same proportions as an adult, they just make him smaller. Yeah. But he's not. I mean, an adult head, depending on how tall they are, I went through a lot of pictures of soldiers in the Civil War, because that's the earliest set of photographs you get, and did micrometer measurements of their heads compared to their bodies, because you have a lot of them where they're just standing in a studio portrait holding pistols or whatever. And the average height of a person at that time in the United States was about 5'8", whereas opposed to now it's about 5'10", 5'10 and a half, something like that. And the proportions of the person were, the head was the same size as people have now, it's just that we've gotten 2-3 inches taller on average. And that's true generally, 9 out of 10 cases, that's true of tall people too. If you look at basketball players, their heads are the same size as a shorter person that's just perched atop a very tall body. There are exceptions. Conan O'Brien's a good one, the late night talk shows. He's very tall, but he has an enormous head. So if you don't see him next to anybody, you would swear he was normal size, or maybe even short.
Yeah.
But then you see him standing next to somebody, and he's like 6'4". But
Got it.
he's an anomaly. Most tall people aren't like that. But the head proportion tends to vary. The normal range for head proportions is about a person's about 7 to 7.5 heads tall. A very tall person, like I said, like a basketball player, will be 8 heads tall. But children, depending on how old they are, go all the way down to 4.5. That doesn't sound like much, but believe me, when you see it rather than say it, when you see it on a model, it's enormous.
Yeah.
A 4.5 compared to a 7 to 1 head, it looks like a basketball person on top of their body, which a lot of children do. They look like they have an enormous head nodding on this little body, especially little girls. Big head.
When you've worked on pieces like that, have you found yourself having to go back to your source material to double check, like it just doesn't look right to the eye?
I sometimes, yeah, it's a funny thing, and the human mind and its perceptions, you get, when you're used to looking at a distortion, and that's all you've ever seen, it looks natural to you. And then when you start doing actual measurements and getting things actually correct, compared to life, or as correct as you can get them in a small scale, you do that long enough, and that becomes to look natural to you. And when you see these gross distortions, they look like a caricature or a cartoon. And a lot of the people who think natural proportions look wrong or aren't useful, I've heard people say things like, but the distorted proportions look better on a tabletop. When you try and use natural proportions on a tabletop, it just looks wrong. And I say, well, when you stand at the top of a tall building and you look at people, do they look wrong? If you're like on a balcony and you're looking down at people, it's the same as looking at a tabletop. They don't look wrong. They don't strike you as wrong.
Just a matter of familiarity.
Yeah, it's what you're used to, that's all.
Great. So I don't have it in my notes, but one last thing since we're talking about general sculpting and stuff. At least early on, horses were something that you
I was lousy at.
You weren't satisfied with what you were
Oh
putting
no,
in.
I was not very good at making horses, yeah.
But you've probably over the years sculpted over 100 different horse sculpts, wouldn't you say?
Probably have, yeah. At first they look kind of like hippopotamuses with horse bodies. I did a cursory study of horse anatomy to be able to just get the joints in the right place and the major muscles in various places. But I was so focused on getting humans right that I didn't really have time to study horses. They were a byproduct. And when I finally got down to working on it, that was about the same time as I had a revelation when I was making a sculpture of a dolphin, which I had to do for some reason. I can't even remember what it was for now, the first dolphin I ever made. I couldn't get the shape of the head right. I mean, I'd know it was wrong. I'd look at dolphin pictures from all different angles, and I'd try and sculpt it, and just something about it looked wrong to me. And it wasn't until I realized that the dolphin's head was functional. It wasn't a random arrangement of features that made a dolphin's head the way it was. It was evolved to give the dolphin the maximum range of vision. So the eyes sit up, the jaw below is lower so that the dolphin can look down, up. The only direction it can't really look is directly above it, because the eye sockets come out a little bit above the eye. And the groove in its nose is so that it can look in front of it. And once I realized that, and I made it all work for where the eyes were, it was like a dolphin. I had a similar problem with horses' heads that I had never been able to resolve until, again, I realized that a horse's head's the same way. It's the bones of its head and its jaws and all the rest of it are designed to give the horse, and the groove it has back going behind its eyes, like I said, it's all designed to give the horse the widest field of vision it can possibly have, in case something's sneaking up on it and wants to eat it.
Interesting. So understanding that about the dolphin helped you understand the horse better.
Understand the horse's head better. I could do the body well enough, but like I said, that's just joints and it's mechanical. But the head is a very complex shape, very complex organic shape. And until I understood its function, it was hard to get the shape right.